Thank you, Ian. The next, obviously, the next respondent. So, thanks very much. When you're ready.
Hi everyone, my name's Ian Tucker. I'm a health and social psychologist from the University of East London. And firstly, I'd like to say how much I enjoyed reading the papers in this special issue. I'm the second discussant, and also many thanks for the invitation to write a reflective piece for this for the special issue. So my talk today is going to form the basis of my written reflection piece, which I haven't written yet. And a couple of things I think to note would be that I guess I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective, in that I'm not a psychotherapist. So I'm a kind of social and health psychologist who researches primarily on digital life, with a specific focus on mental health support and emotion. So just as a kind of opening, I really enjoyed reading these papers. They provided significant insight regarding the potential and real impacts of an increased digitization of psychotherapy. So as such, I think the special issue provides a real significant contribution to the field. And I think it's also very interesting, I know we've alluded to this already, very interesting that we're undertaking today's conference kind of all online as well, and understanding what kind of connections and forms of communication work through that medium as well. So I like that kind of meta level of we're talking online and we're doing it online. Another apology. So I received all these papers without the author details on, so I'm going to, in this talk, be referring to them primarily by the title rather than the author. So forgive me for that, but I will certainly rectify that in the written piece. So I want to draw out a few points that I think resonate across the special issue. So as well as some kind of salient points of difference and divergence. So as we know, the use of digital and online platforms raises a wide range of difference from in-person settings. And therefore, I think, and I know we've alluded to this already, it's really important that we don't homogenize the digital, whatever that may be, as if it operates in a kind of single universal way. But there were several kind of resonances from across the papers that I think are important to kind of draw out. So firstly, things such as how online and digital access can improve accessibility, and how that can be really valuable for certain people. For example, those for whom accessing in-person therapy is difficult, i.e. people experiencing kind of social anxiety or vulnerable groups. And also in areas of kind of conflict. So those points I think around accessibility are really important. We also know that, of course, increasing access to psychotherapy is a major priority. So the power of online, the power of the digital to increase access should also not be downplayed. We also note, of course, though, that communicating online is different from in-person connections in several ways. The most obvious is in terms of a very different kind of embodied kind of presence that's mediated by this screen, which changes a lot about how we kind of communicate and degrees of kind of non-verbal communication. But that's not to suggest, of course, that non-verbal communication is entirely absent in online therapy, but it is different, and we need to consider and attend to those points of difference. Thirdly, and I know this came through several of the papers as well, and in previous discussions so far today, we should also attend to the fact that online therapy is not entirely reducible to the idea that technology, in this case in the form of a video conferencing software, and indeed the digital devices through which we access it, is only like a tool or a means to an end. Yeah, we need to attend to the ways that technology transforms behavior, transforms communication and experience in a more kind of fundamental way, and that piece, that point came through in several of the papers, particularly around notions of sort of becoming with technology. And indeed, that has conceptual, empirical, and practical implications. Finally, it's clear to know, that we do not know, of course, what the future holds for online psychotherapy, but what is evident is that it's not going anywhere, and therefore we need to scrutinise through research and practice how we maximise its benefits whilst minimising the challenges. And of course, not all of those are currently known. So that's kind of by way of a kind of opening summary. So I'm going to focus now in a bit more detail on these key notions that existed across the papers, particularly around notions of embodiment, distance, automation, and connection. And I'll start with embodiment. So a key theme across all the papers then was the importance of embodiment in psychotherapy. You know, and as I've already said, online therapy places a screen. You know, our connections immediately mediated between the therapist and client, and that's something that Dale, you know, referred to in his opening this morning. That Hannah Zevin picks up, you know, very well in the distance cure around this notion of, you know, a kind of therapeutic triad now with the therapist, the client, and the communications technology. And of course, as Hannah Zevin says very well, that's not new. Yeah, you know, the idea of there being a mediating technology in therapy is not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination. How it works now is different, but it's not new, the underlying principle. So we've seen this, the body feature in several of these papers. You know, often that might be in terms of the likelihood of only, for example, the head and shoulders being visible, as mine is now, and for most of us at the moment. And also in terms of the distance that the screen places between bodies, although that's distance in a particular understanding of distance. And the phenomenological writings of Merleau-Ponty were drawn upon in several of the papers to emphasize how grounded the therapeutic experience is in the lived experience of the body. Now, in addition to this, I think it's worth considering what happens to the body online when we consider it as not bounded by the limits of the skin, but instead consider it as porous and operating in an extended sense as emergence from a broader set of kind of potentialized relational processes, only some of which will actually come into form in any given setting. And here I want to sort of drop in, I guess, a conceptual kind of contribution and sort of provocation here is from the philosopher of individuation and technology, Gilbert Simondon. So Simondon, I think, is helpful, and he writes a lot about this notion of individuation rather than the individual. Yeah, so he wants to change the starting point of analysis. You don't start with the individual. You start with the process through which an individual operates and comes to be. And this notion of individuation speaks to the way that individual bodies emerge from individuating processes that are kind of beyond the flesh and blood body. And this is a kind of non-highly amorphic model. Yeah, so Simondon's writing kind of against kind of Aristotle in thinking through this, because it does not rely on the idea that individual bodies operate and are based upon a kind of inherent form, but rather they operate as one part of a set of individuating processes. And in psychotherapy, we can think, therefore, that it's not two fixed bodies being connected via a screen, but rather a kind of digital milieu that incorporates several dimensions at play. You know, the client, the therapist, the physical settings of each person. Yeah, we've talked about this today in terms of welcoming people in through the screen into our home spaces or the spaces through which we engage with therapy. The screen, the device we use. Yeah, often we talk about the screen, but the screen could be on multiple different devices of which we can be doing other things with, as well as notions of kind of temporality and space and how they get bound up in these relations as well. So one thing key for understanding here is to analyze this process of individuation as a singularity, but with multiple elements at play. And part of the argument here then is to understand bodies as operating through the movement of information between them and other objects. Yeah, but this is a slightly kind of different notion of information. So this isn't a notion of information understood in the kind of classic information theory sense, you know, i.e. a mechanism for sharing content between bodies and objects. But actually, information for Simondon names the form that individuations take. Yeah, so all objects and living beings emit, transmit, and receive information. And it's that movement that shapes individual and social life. So one can think of the photosynthesis process of a plant flowering through the receiving of information of sunlight. Yeah. Or you could think of the anxious response of a child when receiving the information of an unexpected and sudden loud noise. Yeah. And in that second example, the anxious response can act as information that is transmitted for others to receive, i.e. a parent and their concern at the anxiety of the child. So the question then for online therapy is, how are the ways that information is emitted, transmitted and received by bodies transformed in online settings? Yeah, and we've seen some examples of that throughout the special issue. So one example is the need to kind of look away to be seen to look at. Yeah, so to be seen to be looking at the person on the screen, you actually don't look at them, you'd have to look at the webcam. Yeah, so that idea was an interesting kind of tension. Also the argument drawn upon in the Schrodinger's cat goes online paper around Whitehead's concept of prehension, as prehension in Whitehead is fundamentally a relational concept regarding how bodies and objects shape each other through patterns of informational interaction. So that resonates this theme throughout. I think it also featured in the moving, sensing, feeling bodies paper which stated, and I quote, "I is of a self in motion." And in the looking and listening paper in terms of framing the therapeutic relationship as a single energy force rather than a number of individuals. So that speaks quite nicely to this idea of individuation. Yeah, so looking at it as a kind of milieu, as a relational kind of singularity. So analysing the singularity as operating as a series of interconnected relational processes valuable for capturing the flow or the flows indeed of emotion and affect that will shape the therapeutic encounter. Another place I think where this idea came through was in the virtual reality and screen relations paper, which made reference to what I would refer to as the atmosphere of online therapy, when it talked about asking clients or reflecting on the distance, materiality and texture of the online space. So how does it feel? You know, do you feel hot? Do you feel cold? How far do you feel? How distant do you feel me? So those are all things I think can speak very nicely to this concept of atmosphere, which is featured quite extensively in affect studies so I should probably move on the slide. Yes, that notion, the concept of atmosphere featured in affect studies to speak to a kind of non-reductionist and indeterminate operation of affect in the shaping of our environments. And that's a concept I've used in work I've done around support in online mental health forums, for example. Finally, on embodiment, was something that featured in this notion of kind of virtual reality. Yeah, and in that paper, it pointed to the ways that the increased presence of sensory technologies in our lives makes the boundaries between online, offline, virtual, real increasingly blurry. And I think that's absolutely right. Those dichotomies are simply not helpful, I don't think. And also that our digital lives, our identities should not be considered to be any less real than any other parts of our lives. Yeah, the reality is that our lives are multidimensional, albeit in recent times with an increasing number of digital dimensions. Yeah, and they're not well understood if we rely, solely on this kind of binary real virtual dichotomy. Yeah, so I'm not even keen really on that kind of in real life kind of notion really. And another example then that came through that virtual reality paper is how this wouldn't necessarily be experienced in a kind of universal way. Yeah. So and I know this was mentioned in the paper earlier. People, different age groups experiencing different digital technologies in different differently, taking longer to acclimatise the digital immigrants rather than the digital natives, I think it was. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say around kind of embodiment. The second main point I wanted to pick out was around what I'm going to refer to as smartness, but this, in terms of the special issue, it's what we've been talking around, kind of automation. Yeah. So the use of AI and automation featured in a couple of the papers in the special issue. And indeed, we can see this as part of an increasing number of ways that we live in so-called smart societies. Orat Halpin and Mitchell frame this as in their book, which is a really lovely book called The Smartness Mandate, which captures how there is, as we know, increased pressure in society to adapt to and live in line with automation pressures of smart technologies. There's a significant push for smart technologies in all areas of life, including in mental health support. And indeed, this includes psychotherapy. Automation can operate at multiple levels, as we saw in the earlier papers, from sort of signposting to support to potentially, although we, as noted, we're not sure there's one exactly absolutely fully fledged exists yet, to a fully automated agent taking the place of a human therapist. But we know that's a logical extension of where the certain technologies are aiming for. And indeed, in the Smartness Mandate, Halpin and Mitchell argue that the smartness of technologies create new kinds of relationships with our everyday environments. And at a conceptual level, this goes beyond a purely kind of didactic kind of human body technology relationship to consider the broader ecologies in and through which smartness operates. A key dimension of smartness then is the drive to make society smarter through identifying relations between individuals and population level data. This is a new thing, Smart technologies work through the generation and categorization of big data, premised on the argument that more data equals better knowledge. So in relation to psychotherapy, this could mean collecting data about therapeutic relations through automated agents for aggregation in the ongoing training of automated therapists. And Aaron alluded to that in relation to Zoom and their terms and conditions in the previous paper. So the idea being that the automated therapist is in a constant state of improvement, in a sense, always being in kind of beta mode. The more data generated and aggregated, the smarter it becomes. This is a kind of central argument of the Smartness Mandate. This means that a smart technology, such as an automated psychotherapist, would not only operate in terms of aiming to improve a client's mental health in an individual therapeutic setting, but would be a part of a broader, more complex ecology operating at the systematic relating of population level data to individual user data. And this is, as was noted in a couple of the papers, works through a process of value extraction, of being able to extract value from this data. And that's something that we're probably aware of Zuboff's work around kind of the notion of surplus value and that being part of this kind of broader surveillance capitalism, which again we've touched on a couple of times in the discussions today. So I think for psychotherapy, that needs to consider what it means for it to become smart in relation to the use of automation. What would smart therapy look like? This is in its infancy currently, but there will of course be efforts to automate psychotherapy, largely driven by industry. And again, we sort of touched on that with kind of BetterHelp in the previous discussion. Halpin and Mitchell refer to this as part of an epistemology of derivation, which captures the way that smart technologies operate derivatively to create surplus value. And therefore, the analysis of the potential impacts of automation involves a more expanded and distributed unit of analysis. That the factors at play operate beyond the client-therapist relationship and involve the broader kind of system-level context through which therapeutic relations individuate, to go back to that notion of individuation. So this was picked up in the special issue when talking about therapy sessions being interrupted by people walking into the room when clients were undertaking therapy. Indeed, the AI automation and psychotherapy paper offered a model based on human factors to consider how AI may operate in therapy, from a kind of low automation through to a full automation. With a high automation involving a therapeutic encounter with a fully autonomous virtual therapist. Yeah. Significant questions then are raised in the paper regarding full automation, including whether elements of a therapeutic relationship can be automated, such as empathy, trust, compassion, those traditionally very human characteristics. Also, the paper made a point around the human therapist is often trained to look for what isn't there as much as for what is. And could you train could you automate that, basically? However, it's interesting that paper does note possible benefits of automation, such as the view that as, and I quote, human therapists are inevitably not always present in the room, perhaps due to compassion fatigue, burnout, or just being distracted on a cognitive level. On this position, where the human is displaying a more performative empathy, perhaps the virtual therapist, fully on message and attentional to the needs of the client, offers the more thorough and successful therapeutic outcome for the client. So there's a lot bound up in that, yeah, but it's an interesting provocation nonetheless. So the impact of smartness in the form of automation raises several questions, such as whether AI can sufficiently replicate a therapeutic setting. Can it be empathetic? Does it need to be for a therapy to be effective? Can that be programmed to a level that has therapeutic value? And if so, should it be pursued? Yeah, even if that value is less than the value of therapy with a human therapist. Okay. Do shout if I'm running out of time. I'm thinking I've probably got about 5 minutes, but stop me if you need to. So I've got a couple more concepts I wanted to kind of draw out from across the papers. The first one is the notion of topology, and this relates to distance. So this, I think, is a useful concept here, and it was picked up sort of indirectly and more directly in some of the papers throughout the special issue. And I've drawn on some work around topology as it featured in the social psychology of the mid-20th century psychologist Kurt Levine. So an example of topology then is how, so the notion of topology is a kind of non-Euclidean idea. Yeah, so it's not about physical proximity and physical distance as we traditionally understand it. It's about kind of emotional, psychological distance as through notions of kind of folding. Yeah, so an example would be, for example, how we can, as we may well be doing now, feel closer to someone we're communicating potentially on the other side of the world or from a long physical distance away when we're connecting with them digitally, i.e. via Zoom or something, than we would by our neighbor who is only a few meters away, you know, geographically, yeah, in that kind of Euclidean sense of distance. So the point Levine and others have made is that to understand the strength and operation of relations, we do not have to rely on a geometric sense of distance, you know, i.e. physical proximity, but rather a topological connection can better capture their operation. And this was picked up in the French philosopher Michel Serres' kind of example of the folding of a handkerchief. So you can have the corners of a handkerchief are quite distant, and then just through this notion of fold, you can bring them much closer together. Yeah. So we could argue that online therapy and indeed, you know, digital communication more broadly can be thought to operate topologically, with the screen kind of folding proximal distances into new relations, which can elicit and facilitate valuable emotional connections. Those connections may be different online and in person, but that does not mean that they are without, you know, entirely without emotional value. The next point I wanted to bring out then was around kind of what I'm calling kind of vital technologies, and this is featured in, you know, a few times so far today. So this has come through maybe through the work of Heidegger, most predominantly in the papers, but relates to, you know, a whole broader set of work in kind of new materialist theory and science and technology studies that argues that technologies are not mere tools to aid embodied human life, but are vital agents in the constitution and operation of our lives. So in the Shaping Force of Technology paper, you know, that drew out Heidegger's claim that we do not use technologies to achieve certain goals, but that we become through relations with technologies, and that, to quote in the paper that Heidegger, technology is a way of revealing. So our everyday lives are increasingly operating through relations with technologies, which are integrated in so many areas of life. These are not distinct domains operating independently, but they form networks of relations that constitute our experiences. So in the Shaping Force of Technology paper, they talk about the technique of CBT, and it's not the, and I quote, it's not the effect of a technique that is of interest here, but more how a technique interacts and co-creates us. Yeah, and that was framed as a kind of post-phenomenological approach. In the Looking and Listening in Online Therapy paper, this is captured when it stated, and I quote, that we are part of a new techno-human system, part of new techno-human systems in which therapists are not simply using technology, but being changed by it and are changing of it. So the argument is that technology exists in a more fundamental way than just being a tool. What does this mean in therapy? One example is how we look maybe at group therapy in the Moving, Sensing, Feeling paper. To be seen, and I did touch on this earlier actually, to be seen, to look at clients, it is necessary to not look directly at them on the screen, but to look directly at the webcam. This feels strange at first, as looking at means looking away. It means also that for the most part, a therapist is not looking at the client's faces, which can make it harder to observe their reactions and expressions. So technology here in terms of the screen is creating new ways of seeing and new ways of being seen. Okay, so just a couple of final points from me. I did just want to say, in terms of kind of practical implications, to make reference to the empirical, the more kind of empirical studies, of which I think there were 2 in the paper, around practical applications of online therapy. So the one around counselling students' experiences in Ireland of being taught online, and that how there were some unexpected benefits were experienced for the students and the trainees for doing that, such as being online, allowing a dedicated time for reflection post-teaching sessions, as students were alone and not together, so they didn't have to, you know, they had that moment of reflection they wouldn't have if they were in person. And that overall the students reported a preference for a kind of blended hybrid learning model, with online being valuable, but only as part of an overall learning experience that includes in-person learning. And the second one then being around the virtual parent-infant psychotherapy paper, which is findings from quantum qual analysis supporting the value of virtual therapy, although participants reported a challenge in not having a transitional space between home and therapy. And I think that notion of transitional space is important and has been alluded to earlier. So I'm pretty confident. I'm fast running out of time, so I just want to summarize for 1 minute, if that's okay. What is clear from the special issues is that whilst undertaking therapy online can transform it in multiple ways, it does not entirely negate its therapeutic value. The papers discuss multiple experiences of undertaking successful online therapy, in some places facilitating modes of engagement for clients that would not be possible in person, yeah, i.e. not showing one's face. There were many challenges, such as changing the dynamic in terms of the potential for non-verbal embodied communication. For future research and practice, the papers elicited key questions. For instance, was the transition to online easier in situations where existing in-person relationships existed? I think that's important. Could a hybrid model work? You know, can the benefits of in-person being sustained when combined with online sessions? Also, the idea that actually maybe online therapy is requiring therapists to, and I quote from the Schrodinger's cat paper, build bridges between different paradigms, such as computation and psychoanalytic frameworks. Also, just to very quickly say, you know, interesting points made around who gets to decide what's normal in terms of the ideas around post-COVID clinical practice. And also that maybe we should question this, what could be considered sometimes a default position of considering online as by definition inferior. Yeah, so trying to avoid that setting up a competition between online and in person. And finally then, just just to say that we need to recognize also that the regulation, the ethical frameworks are lagging behind in terms of online therapy and indeed digital life more broadly. So we need to work to support their development to ensure safe and secure therapeutic settings online and in person. And as we've already said, digital online access is here to stay. So we definitely need to understand its possibilities and limitations. Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. I mean, but there's so many things, and you've managed to pull a lot of them all together for us, which might help us quite a lot in small groups.